Well, let's get started anyway, and hopefully they will show up. We'll get a little bit quickly, but thanks everybody for coming. It's a series of talks. They're all touching on issues of food security health, and we're going to have about 15-ish minutes for presentations to allow for some quick discussions and questions afterwards. So, and then we'll have a little bit of time. If we can pull this off, we'll have a little bit of time again. We'll talk about the whole session. So, I turn things over to you.
All right, thanks so much for coming, and for those of you online, thanks so much for joining us. So my name is James Chi. I will be joining the University of Florida very soon. This is cohort work with Amanda Gumbo. Amanda Gumbo is at University of Sherbrooke in Canada, and Nydia Menon and Liz Long is at Brandeis University, where I'm previously affiliated. All right, so today what we're going to talk about is the essentially the salinity impact on a bunch of health outcomes in coastal Bangladesh. And we're trying to first pin down the impact of what is the impact of salinity on early life health outcomes, and then try to say something about what causes these impacts, the mechanisms. We're currently scratching our head as to what really causes this. We think we have some idea of what's going on here, but then we'd love to hear what you think about this. So effects of climate change are becoming more and more salient in Bangladesh, which is a very low-lying vulnerable country to a bunch of climate impacts, including sea level rise, cyclones, but also seawater intrusion and salinity of land and water sources in that country. Coastal belt of Bangladesh is home to more than 10 million people, 10 million poor people, I should say. And they're particularly hit by increased salinity level. There are documents saying that around the past decade, salinity level has really elevated in that area of the world by a lot. Right? And salinity impacts livelihood. If we think about how would salt be affecting your life, it can be through multiple channels. It could be through agriculture, where your crop yields are being decreased because the soil and water are being more salty. It could be changing local ecosystem. Mangroves, for example, are being changed. Mangrove ecosystems, which are a big part of the local ecosystem there, are being changed. And then there are also being substitutions as to how suitable are for shrimp agriculture in there. But also there are other type of links between salinity exposure and human outcomes. For example, there are medical literature saying that salt intake are associated with hypertension and heart diseases. But then that link is, as we'll see, harder to detect there. Now, what we are going to do here is this. We're firstly going to do an impact analysis to see what is the effect of in utero salinity exposure, which is when the child is still in their pregnancy period, when the mother is exposed to higher salinity levels, what's going to happen? So to do that, we leverage a repeated cross-sectional observation in about 20 years for about 20 years of data, and then we geographically link that with salinity levels coming from the ocean. So how much salt is in the ocean's water, which and we have a pretty good measure of that. And then we also have weather data, we have other type of ocean chemistry data, and then we're trying to say what is the impact of salinity exposure on child health outcomes. And then we will be so what do we finding that? We find that children are shorter, are skinnier, and are lighter when exposed to higher salinity levels, right? So they're indicating both acute and chronic nutritional deficiencies. And then we go on to really explore what's the channel behind these health impacts. And that's where we're sort of seeking additional comments here. Is what we have been doing with the data available is we have been probing several channels. First is parents seems to be under investing in healthcare. So if you're exposed to higher salinity levels, we actually find that there are underinvestment in prenatal and delivery care. So people are more likely to be taking their giving birth at home instead of going to a hospital. They're less likely to actually going to prenatal care. We actually see vaccination rates drop after the kid is born. So that's sort of parents that is sort of associated with an income hypothesis where parents have less resource to spare, so that they're underinvesting in their child and in their own health. The other channel that we're exploring here is through agricultural land use. So what we find is that land allocation shifts away from irrigated agriculture into rain-fed agriculture, which has been documented to be a adaptation strategy to salinity exposure, but that is with the cost of significantly lowered crop yield and profitability. So that also maybe taps into the income hypothesis of now you have less income, so that's where these effects are coming from. Now, so our contribution to the literature, first, we're speaking to a very broad literature on the fetal origin hypothesis, which essentially says whatever you are exposed during the pregnancy period for the baby is going to have a very long-run impact on the child's early life and including later life social outcomes. There are hundreds of papers on that hypothesis. Now, we also speak to a smaller literature, a smaller recent but booming literature on the link between environmental shocks and nutritional outcomes. There are studies done on air pollution that says air pollution is making people more obese in China. Is making there are nutritional outcomes. There are nutritional deficiencies in India. We've seen there are extreme heat impacts on nutrition. There's a new gene paper by Blom et al. Saying that extreme heat is making essentially making children. So this literature usually focused on, there is a lot of research on sort of the agronomy / agricultural production impact of salinity, right? So, but then that doesn't really taps into the social outcomes. There is also two papers that we found, one on how salinity is affecting child's education. The other is how salinity is increasing infant mortality. Though in both of these studies, the mechanism is not very clear in either of these studies. Now, so to take you briefly to what is our data, we have 6 rounds of geo-referenced demographic and health survey for Bangladesh, so DHS. The DHS in Bangladesh from 1999 to 2017. So what we did is we take every kid from the age 0 to 5 and then retrospectively construct the exposure when they're actually in their mother's womb. So when they're during their in utero period. Now, where is our salinity data from? We have data from the European Space Service, essentially, which records monthly data on seawater salinity, seawater temperature, sea surface height, pH from 1993 to December of 2019. So why we're using ocean? There are 2 reasons. First is we suspect that there are, if we're actually using land-based surveys on salinity, they're based on stations. So, and there could be endogeneity issues, meaning that if a place is actually shifting towards aquaculture, that actually increases salinity levels around that period. So, and using ocean salinity essentially gives us an exogenous shock of what's actually happening on the ground, instead and free of, well, no one manipulates how much salt in the ocean, right? Other than climate change. And it's actually it's for oceans it's actually quite precise in the sense that 8 kilometers point times 8 kilometers seems to be giving us enough variation for us to be able to say something about the impact. We also have weather data from station month level, year level data from 35 stations across Bangladesh. We also, and then we match that with the geocoded locations, DHS locations. Yeah. Now here's the issue, right? So we sort of divide our model into different sections. So the red is what we define as the vulnerable vulnerable communities, which is we suspect that these people are going to be the most impacted, and then followed by the red, followed by the yellow, and then followed by the green, right? So we would expect differential impacts. So if the salt is coming from the ocean, we would expect that these people who are living right next to the ocean to be the most impacted. So we actually have a spatial spillover model where we're trying to detect, is there any, so whether these people are actually more impacted, these people are less impacted. It seems so, but then the distance seems to be around 40 to 70 kilometers is when you see the impact starts to go away, which is sort of, there's a Arman paper. So Alex Arman has a paper that in that paper, he is trying to use a global data set and trying to say that pH impacts fisheries, and then in his definition, it seems to be 40 to 50 kilometer is what's known as a vulnerable population, meaning that these are really the coastal communities that depends on the ocean to live. Other than, so if you're thinking about these inland areas, they're less impacted. But thanks for the question.
Pathway that salinity affects the bird outcomes through the fishery industry, or
so in our case, it's not through fishery, it's through land-based agriculture activities. And then there's also maybe a separate impact from house investments. In Arman's paper, in the other paper that that also touches upon the ocean link, they're probing a different link. So they're directly probing what is the fishery potential around the coastal communities. We're sort of asking a different question here. Or rather a different mechanism through which these impacts are actually conveying. All right, ooh, what is that? Man. Sorry, I was like, where is my slide? I think I've deleted, where am I? Okay, back, sorry. All right, I'm back. So our empirical strategy, I'm just showing our empirical strategy for the impact study. So on the left hand side, we have a bunch of outcome measures, including weight for height, weight for age, and height for age for children's under the age of 5. And then we reverse that on the beta coefficient is our coefficient of interest here. So what is the impact of salinity on these outcomes that we care about? Then we have a bunch of controls that are both on weather and on ocean chemistry controls. And we also have household and children controls as well. And then we tackle that, we accompany that with a host of fixed effects, essentially a saturated fixed effect at the district level, at the year level, and then there are interactions between district by year level, right? So 5 minutes, so I need to be quick. So first, we find negative impacts of higher in utero salinity exposure on both acute and chronic nutritional deficiencies. We find that 1 standard deviation increase in utero salinity leads to about 0.11 standard deviation decline in HAZ index, which is approximately 7.5% of the overall variations in HAZs, which is saying that salinity is explaining about 75% of the overall determinants of how tall we are, essentially. Or sorry, in this case, yeah, how tall we are. And it's explaining about 13.6% of how heavy we are, essentially. So we think this is pretty meaningful economic impact, but then it's sort of in line with some of the other studies that look at environmental shocks. Yes.
so these were for children over 0 to 5,
Yeah, 0 to 5.
including the newly born.
Including newly born. So newly born, there is a separate metric. So these HAZ score and WAZ scores are all standardized, so we can compare them, right? All right, gonna skip that. So we did a bunch of robustness checks. Just gonna show you one of them, in which we in this we did exposure window analysis, where the first 2 dots are essentially 3 to 4 months and 1 to 2 months before birth. The third is in utero exposure, and then the fourth is month of birth, and then the fifth is 1 trimester after birth. So what we see here is in all of these 9 metrics that we care about, the impact seems to be concentrated exactly during the in utero periods, and somewhere in some of these is on the month of birth. Then month of birth is not measured in precise, so maybe some later in term kids are having this. But then the impact seems to be concentrated in during the in utero period. Now, there's the spatial spillover graph that you sort of talked about. So the impact seems to be concentrated around 40 to 70 kilometers, but it's a bit noisy. Now, okay. All right, so I also, let's see, I shouldn't be. Oh, I'm not. Okay. Let's see. Sorry about that. Okay, so next, with the next 2 minutes, I'll talk about mechanism. So we first tackled healthcare mechanism, where what we find is that we use the DHS data on how parent investment, and what we find is that salinity exposure leads to significant decrease in women seeking prenatal and delivery care, and they're also the child are less likely to be vaccinated. So that's actually a bit different from what another paper in this literature have found. In that literature, they seems to be finding a compensating effect. So if you have income shock, parents seems to be compensating that by spending more on the children. In this paper, we actually found parents spend less on the children, which we believe actually makes more sense. Now, I'll spend the next about 1 minute talking about what we are doing with agriculture. So we actually, we accompany our main data set with a annual land use data set from the European Space Service, which gives us a 300 meter by 300 meter land use data on now. So and then we estimate the land use regression, where we regress the annual land use on salinity levels, a bunch of weather controls and fixed effects, and the air return. Now, what we find is that if a particular cluster and then a buffer around that cluster is exposed to higher salinity levels or higher salinity shocks, they're shifting into more rain-fed and less irrigated crop, which the literature has sort of documented as a local effective adaptation strategy. But then, and they're also shifting from the dry burrows, use that some more resilience towards towards salinity, but then really less profitability. And that seems to be tapping into what's going on here. When we add in the land use indicators into our main regression, the effect completely goes away. So after so that seems to be indicating that land use is at least one of the most important mechanisms in now, I'm just gonna skip that. And final quick words. Yep. We provide one of the first estimates on rising ocean salinity on early life outcomes, and then we indicate that there are nutritional deficiencies after exposing to higher salinity levels, and that seems to we're one of the few studies that really taps into linking environmental shocks and specifically salinity on early life outcomes. Thanks.
Minutes for questions. I wonder about because it does seem like it could be correlated, but I don't think the pathway is possible, especially since vaccine happens after a baby is born, and what you're showing, it kind of contradicts what you're showing about most of this being in utero and at our time of birth that matters. So I don't know. I guess. Just what is your justification? I understand that maybe kind of available maybe to mark general household investment in child health. Is that what you're trying to do?
So what we're trying to say here is this is if we believe this is an income shock, meaning that families have less income when they're exposed to higher salinity levels from these decreased agriculture profitabilities, maybe, right? Can't say for sure, but that seems to be pointing to that. If family have less resources, they will spend less resources on children. So, and that includes if the family really have less resource, that spills over into the post-natal period where they decide whether to vaccinate their kids. So if they have less income, at least it's a consistent, we believe it's a consistent story that they spend less on their children, which is
yeah, I'd be careful too, because vaccination, as you may realize, through pandemic is also very it can be very preference based. I think you have to really make sure that there isn't a lot of vaccine hesitancy for other reasons in Bangladesh. I think to rely on that as an indicator of income. And does the Bangladesh government charge for vaccines or are they free?
I will check.
Yeah, because if it's free, it would just be the transportation cost, I guess, which is the only cost of it.
I will go back and check. That's a great question. And the other thing I should say is vaccination is a very controversial topic in this country, but not all over the world. But I will double check.
That's growing, and some countries are actually even worse, and some countries are better, like in terms of like.
Yeah, your point I will take, and I will go back and look at data and see what I can explore.
I forgot a couple, but before that, we have this different detail in the audience. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there's a particular reason why you chose to use spatial fixed effects as opposed to kind of spatial econometrics like live or spatial error models. If you like that might better capture contaminant movement of the environment.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and that's sort of it's actually a question that in all my work I encounter this question. As long as we do any spatial work, it's a valid question. My take is we're essentially so our framework is actually similar to the other climate studies where what we're exposing we're exploiting here is shock after taking care of seasonality, after taking of year-to-year variations, taking care of essentially regional variations at the level of the fixed effect. So as long as that gives us a credible, let's say, causal interpretation of what we're finding in our impacts, I think I'm fine with that. Now, doing a spatial error model would be helpful, though I personally have I have a slight issue with how to interpret that error term, meaning that is that part of the effect or is that not part of the effect, meaning that whether a region, like some outcome in a region is correlated with its neighbors. Yes, but then that said, I think there are certainly values in doing that, and we'll see what we can do on that. But and the other, yeah. Thanks.
Actually, hold those and go. You should have time at the end to come back. That's okay. We may have more time than we expected the other participants to show up, but we're going to turn things over to Dietary. Unless there is something here who's like the second paper on all this. All right. We may get later or we'll have more time for discussion all here. Thanks. Sorry to cut you off.
Okay, good afternoon and thanks for joining my presentation. I am Tanya Kwon. I'm doing my PhD in Ag, Food and Resource Economics at Michigan State. And this is a paper that I've been doing with Dr. Myers and Dr. Mason from our department. So today I will be presenting about how do these input subsidy programs affect smallholder households' dietary diversity, focusing on the case of Zambia. So in sub-Saharan Africa, where food security is the most alarming issue, like the agricultural input subsidy programs researched in early 2000s, and they've been constituted the core of their agricultural development programs in order to boost agricultural productivity, food security, and incomes of the farmers. However, there have been some there's been some criticism that most of these agricultural and food security policies, including the input subsidies, mainly focused on the availability dimension of food security, or only on a few cereal crops or the staple crops. While that is still important, given that much more people are suffering from nutrition deficiencies than the number of people who are suffering from hunger, in our paper, we focus on the dietary diversity dimension of food security. And this household dietary diversity is a proxy measure of the household's ability to access different kinds of food to meet its members' nutritional requirement. Okay, so here is the conceptual framework. We hypothesize that input subsidies, by affecting agricultural production, have influence on dietary diversity mainly through two underlying channels, which are the own production pathway and the farm income pathway. So the input subsidies are mostly focused on subsidizing inputs for staple crop production, which means that the smallholders can meet their staple crop production or staple crop need with less resources, since now they are giving this inputs at subsidized or reduced prices. So they might be able to use this spared resources toward producing other non-staple crops or even raising livestock. And then if it is the case that producing more, like if it is the case that smallholders consume what they produce, producing more diverse food means that they might be able to consume more diverse food. On the other hand, input subsidies by boosting agricultural productivity might allow smallholders to have more surplus to sell in the market so they can earn farm income, which then they can use to buy food in the market and meet their nutritional requirements. However, all these pathways are very context specific because there are many factors affecting those processes. So focusing on the case of Zambia, we try to answer the question like, how does Zambia's input subsidy program affect, and for that production diversity, but it had no effect on the farm income part. And second, we asked like, what is the effect of this input subsidies on household dietary diversity? For this, we found that it is negatively associated with smallholder household dietary diversity. So, and then this is the, as far as we know, this is the first study to unpack and assess the underlying linkages between input subsidies and dietary diversity in Zambia. So why are we focusing on Zambia? Zambia is a prime example of implementing very large scale input subsidy programs. As you can see here in the gray part, in 2017, the government of Zambia spent more than 50% of their total agriculture budget only on this input subsidy program, which they call the Pharma Input Support Program, or FISP. So how this program works is that farmers who meet some eligibility criteria apply to participate in the program, and if they get selected, they receive some maize, fertilizer, or seed packages under the traditional FISP. It is traditional or conventional because recently there has been some changes. The government introduced this electronic voucher system where the farmers can redeem at private agro suppliers to obtain inputs that they need, not just maize inputs. However, this electronic voucher system has not been very much successful. So it is only implemented in certain regions of the country, and still the farmers are redeeming mostly maize-related inputs. So even though the Zambia has spent a lot of money on their program, Zambia is still known as one of the most food insecure countries. And then here, as you can see, less than 10% of the smallholder households are consuming well-diversified diet, either in 2015 or 2019. So we are using the Rural Agricultural Livelihood Survey, which is a nationally representative household panel survey covering more than 7,000 households across the country. And we are using the last two waves of the survey, the 2015 and 2019, which covers the previous agriculture year. The first wave we could not use because it didn't collect any dietary diversity information. We also use some rainfall data and general election results. So our main outcome variable, dietary diversity, we measure it by household dietary diversity score, which is counted as the number of food groups that were consumed in the household in the last 24 hours. So the households are presented 12 different food groups, and for each of the food group, they answer whether they did consume it or not. So it ranges from 0 to 12, 12 indicating the most highly diversified diet. In terms of FISP, we focus on FISP fertilizer part because fertilizer is the main single input distributors for FISP, and this is because some data limitations. So we focus on a FISP fertilizer, and we measure participation in this getting subsidized fertilizer in 2 ways. First is a binary receipt. One, if the household received any subsidized fertilizers for FISP. And second is the level. It's like the total amount of FISP fertilizer received by the households. This is to account for the fact that different households get different amount of fertilizer, and we wanted to account for that. So we were interested in understanding the underlying channels. So we are going to see the effect of FISP on the own production diversification decisions in the growing season, and also the effect of FISP on the sales and farm income activities in the marketing season, and eventually the effect of FISP on household dietary diversity. In terms of production diversification, we measure it by this food group diversity index, which is counted as the number of food groups produced by the household. It ranges from 0 to 7, 7 indicating the household's production is highly diversified. And then for the farm income part, we use the aggregate value of sales from own production, which constitutes most of the farm income in rural Zambia. And it is just the price times the amount of quantity sold in the market. So this is our regression equation. See here, the outcome variable can be either food group diversity, value of sales, or household dietary diversity score. And then we have our main variable of interest, the FISP participation. We have year fixed effects, staple crop price P, and household income measure Y. And then we have household, farm, and market characteristics, the vector of B. And then finally, we have household fixed effects A, which controls for time invariant household specific factors. And we are using fixed effects instrumental variable estimation. This is because we are concerned that participation in FISP is not random. Households can self-select themselves into applying and getting the subsidized fertilizer. So based on the literature, we use locality election results as our instrument. So this election variable is 1 if the member of parliament in the household's constituency is from the ruling party that won in the last presidential election. That is that we hypothesize that households who live in constituencies where the ruling party won are more likely to receive FISP fertilizer and also likely to receive more FISP fertilizer once they got selected. This is based on previous study that in Zambia, for political reasons, the ruling party is likely to allocate much more subsidized inputs in the areas where they won. And while we cannot test for the exclusion restriction, we argue that the election results are out of control from the individual households, and households are not expected to move across constituencies just to get more subsidized inputs. So our expectation is that this election results does not affect the outcome variables except through its impact on households' participation in the FISP. So this is our first main regression results. In the last row, we have the F statistic from the first stage, and in all cases, we find that our instrument is highly relevant to participation in FISP. And then we have 2 specification, because first one here, we are doing FISP participation, we are measuring FISP participation as this binary variable, and in the second column, we are measuring it as the amount of FISP fertilizer received. And in both cases, we find that receiving FISP fertilizer is positively and statistically significantly related to producing more diverse food. But then we wonder because this FISP was maize-centric, like staple crop-centric program, so why would that be promoting the production of other food groups. So we did some decompositions. So here are the effects of first fertilizer on production of each food group that constitute the food group diversity index. And we found that first fertilizer is promoting the chance of producing more vegetables and fruits. And also we divided our sample into 3 agroecological regions. And we only found that first fertilizer had positive effect on this diversification in region 2, which is this orange and green area. And it is the most productive area in Zambia, given moderate amount of rainfall and moderate soil conditions. So this suggests that FISP is adding to production diversity by first promoting the production of vegetables and fruits, and then also incentivizing households who are living in this favorable agroecological conditions to even more diversify their production. And second, we found that FISP fertilizer had no effect on the value of sales that constitute farm income. However, one thing to note is that we have off-farm income share, which is the ratio of income earned from off-farm activities to the total income. And we find that households with higher off-farm income share, they tend to have significantly less value of sales from farm activities. So this might suggest that households who have many off-farm income opportunities, like they're living near big towns, so they might be allocating their resources away from doing farming and selling the agricultural products toward other off-farm income activities to earn income. So in this line, it might be the case that first fertilizer is kind of reducing their cost for their inputs. So with this spared resources, they might be investing in other off-farm income activities rather than investing in agriculture and earn farm income. And then we have the effect of first fertilizer on household dietary diversity. Here we found that receiving first fertilizer is negatively associated with household dietary diversity, which is kind of surprising, because earlier we found that first is raising production diversity. So we earlier found that FISP was raising the chance of producing vegetables and fruits. We did some same decomposition here. Results are not shown, but we found that receiving FISP is related to less chance of consuming fruits, and it had no effect on consuming vegetables. So our argument here is that even though FISP is raising production diversity is not leading to consumption diversity in case of Zambia. So to conclude, we found this positive association between FISP and production diversification. However, such positive effect was not observed nationwide, but it was rather driven by a region that has favorable agroecological conditions. So when farmers living in those regions get these input subsidies, they would have much more incentives to even more diversify, because they already have some favorable conditions to do crop production. So this would suggest that there's this need to tailoring the FISP policies by different characteristics across the region to have better effectiveness. And then we found no evidence that FISP fertilizer had influence on the value of sales that constitute farm income. And overall, we found that FISP is negatively associated with household dietary diversity. So as I just mentioned, this may be due to the weak or even negative connection between production diversity and consumption diversity. And earlier studies found that in regions where they have already highly diversified production, like producing even more kinds of products would harm their income, because they would not be able to specialize in the crops they are already producing. And then our findings are actually different from previous studies that found that FISP has some positive effect on household dietary diversity, but using different data and different econometric methodologies. So we need more evidence on this topic and then need more agreement. However, we would suggest that it is important to better understand the underlying channels to better design and implement the programs so that they have more nutrition sensitive agriculture objectives. Thank you.
I've heard a couple questions and I'm gonna just check to make sure our other presenter isn't hanging out online, but if you go ahead and. Yeah, but go ahead and answer questions.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. I was wondering if either you or anyone on your team had any conversations with farmers to get a little bit of more understanding around their decisions around planting and marketing, if that could help sort of just shed more light on their decisions around how the program induced vegetable food production, but then also seemingly induced, like what were the decisions around production and marketing?
Yeah, I was actually part of this survey collection when I was in Zambia, but I haven't been in the area in region 2 where they are producing much more vegetables and fruits, the cash crops in other areas. But my thought is that, so these vegetables and fruits are kind of cash crops. So they are producing it, but then they are just selling it away instead of consuming themselves. So yeah, and then, but there has been some like issues regarding this first, because first like the inputs are supposed to be delivered in the early growing season, but then it happens a lot that the delivery is kind of late, so they are not getting the inputs at the right time. So that is an issue that we could not we could not address here, but we need to take into account. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have data on whether they're selling?
Sorry about that.
Do you have data on whether the households are selling fruits and vegetables? Selling it to the market?
Yes, we have whether they are sold or not, and then the amount of
So that's something that you could examine, right? Like whether the subsidy is fertilizer subsidy is actually increasing the amount sold. So that could be one challenge. You can say that that's the reason why even the production diversity is improving. It's not translating into, because they're basically selling it away for the.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you.
So, 2 comments on the metrics. Would it be possible to try regression discontinuity?
Discontinuity in terms of
the winning versus losing part. So if the winning part is 50%, by 49%, we should see something, and 51%.
Yeah, so in other studies, they're actually using like by how much difference the ruling party won. But in our case, like we could not get access to the real detailed data. We were just able to get whether they won or not there. But if we can get access, that's definitely a point to do. Thank you. Yeah.
If you look at all of the difference between the physical FISIP versus the e-FISIP, because honestly, when we found the dietary diversity impact, it was specifically looking at e-FISIP versus the
right.
FISIP.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so what we did here, so we are using 2 waves of panel, the 2015 and 2019. 2015 is when the traditional FISP was going on, and 2019 is just when the electronic voucher FISP was introduced. But then we have data limitations that we could not have this exact variable. But we argue, but we did include some interaction terms about this FISP participation and our year fixed effects, because year is 1 if it's 2019 and 0 2015. But we found that the infection term is not statistically significant. We have it in our paper, but I'm not presented it here. But we thought that it's in the early years of FISP, the farmers are redeeming most of maize-centric. So even though it moved on to electronic voucher, they are still redeeming this traditional FISP, like maize fertilizer seeding, so that we don't see like any specific differences between the effect of traditional FISP and electronic voucher FISP. Thank you.
Now for a little bit of a switch, and I apologize to folks in the audience. The paper that is currently on your program is actually being presented tomorrow at a panel at 1 o'clock. So instead, Aditya is going to present, I think it's highly relevant work looking at the Indian public distribution system and its effect on child nutrition. So a little, sorry for the change up in the program, sorry if you rudely impose that on you all, but I think you'll, hope you'll enjoy the video.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to present. Yeah, it is. Oops. It's going into. How can I end slideshow? How can I just do like without? Can I just present it this way? Yeah, I'm just going to present it this way. Yeah, this was kind of a last minute thing. But yeah, this is extremely relevant for this particular section. So the paper is on the effect of food transfers on child and adolescent nutrition in India. This is in with collaboration with Kathy and Ben. So it's just to motivate the paper. It's well known that child malnutrition is a global public health concern, and a lot of children around the globe are stunted. So stunting here is a measure of lack of height, linear growth. It's defined as the number of standard deviation, like 2 standard deviations below the reference population, and it's been shown that stunting has had lasting impacts on illness, physical impairment, and also is associated with lower human capital accumulation, productivity, and earnings. So it has this intergenerational effect on poverty. And we also look at adolescent malnutrition character and catch-up growth, and that could also have consequences for long-term growth. So this map shows stunting rates around the world, and as you can see, South Asia, like India, is a hotspot. Even though stunting rates have decreased from 2000 to 2015, it still remains pretty high. And the context where we study is food transfers in India, which is the public distribution system in India. It's the world largest food transfer program, and it's also the largest social program in India. And it's basically it's basically the government provides a ration of rice and wheat that's sold below the market price to ration card holders. So it's a targeted program, and it is provided through a network of fair price shops or ration shops, and there are a massive number of fair price shops. So there's almost like a ration shop in almost every village in India. So it's a huge program, and food subsidies and transfers in general is also very big. Close to 44% of individuals on welfare programs receive in-kind food, and that covers more than 1.5 billion people. So in this paper, we ask whether these programs, the food transfer programs, improve child and adolescent nutrition. And we use to identify the effect, we use this large expansion of food transfers that happened in India in 2013, which was the National Food Security Act. So basically, under this act, the central government mandated these basic minimum criteria at which the states had to provide ration. So before NFSA, states had a lot of discretion at the quantities and prices at which they could give to their beneficiaries. But after NFSA said 3 rupees per kg for rice and 5 kg per individual.
So the states that were out of compliance had to expand, had to bring in their entitlements, the prices and quantities in line with the mandate. So they expanded, and the states that were already in compliance kind of continued as they are. So this gives a nice kind of difference in difference framework, where the states that are out of compliance and expanded are the treatment states, and the states that continued as they are the control states. So that's the state and time variation. We also have within state variation because the act changed the quantity mandate, which was from per household, 35 kg per household, to 5 kg per individual. So it was larger for larger households in the states that expanded. And that's the variation. We employ that to data set from the ICRISAT, which is a panel data set of 1,300 households, which have more than 650 under 5 children and 1,300 adolescents. There are 30 villages across 8 states, and we have annual data. It's like a panel data of at the individual level, and we have 5 years of individual panel data. And we also use this instrument that I will explain later. So we instrument transfers using these changes in this NFSA rules to identify the effect on stunting. Okay, this is changed. Yeah, I don't know. Oh yeah. So we in just a quick summary, we find that the transfers does increase hyper-8 z-score, and it reduces stunting. And the novel part about this paper is that we are showing the mechanisms through which the food transfers affect child and adolescent nutrition. So we show that it improves dietary diversity. It improves particularly the increase in animal protein intake. We also show that it has effects on local prices. It reduces local prices, and it also has effects on local labor markets. It improves labor earnings of poor households by improving the wages, the local wages of these villages. But I'm just going to focus on the results on dietary diversity and stunting. And lastly, we also show that these effects are the largest in years with bad rainfall shock. So the transfer seems to have larger effects during years with a bad rainfall. So in all, we're showing that the food transfers can lead to big improvements in child and adolescent nutrition through improved diet quality. So we make 3, I'm going to quickly go through these slides. We make 3 main contributions. First is that we're showing food transfers alone can improve stunting. This previous literature has mostly shown that transfers need to be complemented with a behavioral intervention component, and transfers by itself have limited impacts on stunting. But here we are finding that food transfers by itself have large effects on stunting. And second, we show that food transfers improve dietary diversity. I mean, previous evidence is kind of mixed, and studies have shown like very small or null effects of food transfers on dietary diversity. And third, we also contribute to this literature on climate shocks, showing that climate shocks affect child nutrition. And here we're showing that food transfers through improved dietary diversity can mitigate this the adverse effects of climate shocks on nutrition. So going on to the identification strategy. So before NFSA, as I mentioned, states had a lot of discretion in which they set the prices. These are the 8 states in the data that we use. So as you can see, Bihar was selling rice at 7 rupees per kg, but Jharkhand was selling it at 1 rupee per kg. And after NFSA set like this target of 3 rupees per kg. So the states that were out of compliance, like Bihar, had to bring it in line to meet the target. But the states that were already compliant continued as they are. And there are a couple of concerns with this identification, because there were states that overshot the mandated target because Some of these overshooting were correlated with local elections. For instance, Madhya Pradesh overshot the target to bring it below 3 rupees, and Karnataka also reduced it to 1 rupee. And there's also this endogeneity in the timing of the rollout. So what we do is this: we employ an instrument variable strategy where we assume that states did just the bare minimum to meet the mandated target. And so we assume away this extra out of the extra expansion that was done by some of the states. So the IV measures purely the effect of NFSA. So the way we measure PDS transfer is the rice transfer value plus the wheat transfer value. And we look at the effect of this transfer value on the height-for-age z-score with individual and time fixed effects. So as I mentioned, we have 5 rounds of anthropometric data. So NFSA was enacted in 2013. So we are identifying 1 year exposure of the NFSA, and we don't find any pre-trends in the outcomes. For instance, stunting doesn't show any pre-trends, and after NFSA, stunting reduces. So here we find that height-for-age z-score increases. And stunting decreases, and we see that the program seems to have effect only on like moderate stunting rather than severe stunting. So for instance, a PDS expansion of 35 rupees per capita, which is around 5% of the household consumption, the height-for-age z-score increases by 0.14 standard deviation, and that reduces the proportion of children stunted by around 6 percentage points. And the magnitude is very comparable to all the previous studies that have looked at transfers and tried a bunch of robustness tests controlling for age-specific and household-specific. For instance, we control for BPL status, the ration card status, by time fixed effect. We also control for household size by time fixed effect, because all like household size and BPL's ration card status are all correlated with. I mean, these are the households who experience the expansion more. So you would be concerned that something else might be happening with these households, but it doesn't seem to be affecting our results. I'm sorry. Yeah, we also find like supportive evidence on other indicators of undernutrition. We also find that food transfers improve the arm circumference of children, and we don't find any big effects on women's BMI. We do find that it has it reduces the proportion of women underweight, but we don't find any effects on obesity. And lastly, yeah, we also do like this leads test that is consistent with not finding any pre-trends. I'm sorry. Okay, so lastly, I'm just going to spend the last like 3 or 4 minutes, 3 minutes on looking at the mechanisms. So we look at, we validate whether nutritional mechanism can explain the magnitude of stunting reductions that we see. So we use the same estimation and look at whether the food transfers have effect on food consumption, energy and protein intake, and also budget shares. So here we find that food transfers increase the total energy, protein, and fat intake. So first of all, just the transfer itself is actually reaching the households, and they are improving their energy and protein intake. But households do not increase their purchase of staples from the market. So that is kind of one mechanism through which the transfers is affecting, because the transfer comes in and they're reducing or not changing their out-of-pocket expenditure on rice and wheat. So that extra saving is being used to consume more nutritious food. That's why we find that it improves non-staple food consumption, particularly animal proteins. So for instance, a transfer of 35 rupees increases animal protein by around 1 gram approximately. So that's about 12% increase from baseline. So we also look at household budget shares of animal proteins and staple proteins, and we see that this households are substituting from staple cereals to animal proteins. So in the last 2 minutes, I just want to spend time on the rainfall interaction results. So we interact the transfer variable with the z-score of rainfall quantity, which is a proxy for productivity shock. And we find that rainfall does reduce stunting, a rainfall shock does reduce stunting. That decreased rainfall increases stunting, just to clarify, because this rainfall, like more rainfall reduces stunting and less rainfall decreases stunting. And consistent with all the previous literature that has looked at monsoon and child nutrition outcomes. But when we interact the transfer and the rainfall quantity, we find a positive interaction effect. That is, the transfer is having larger effects on child nutrition during a bad rainfall shock. So just to conclude, we find really large effects on transfers on child stunting, and this effect is large relative to previous studies, and we show that it works through the improvement in dietary diversity, particularly the consumption of animal proteins increases, and these effects are large in years with a bad rainfall shock. And lastly, the implications is that food transfers are still good. I mean, there's a lot of doubt on the effectiveness of food transfers, people moving into cash, but here we're showing that these huge programs are still working pretty well. And the concern over crowding out of other foods is generally not valid, because what we find is that they actually crowds in more nutritious foods. And also we show that it improves, nutritional diversity, particularly during these bad rainfall shocks. And that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
A couple minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Thanks for the paper. I look forward to seeing the other one. This one's terrific.
Yeah.
And can you maybe just go and show us the slide on heterogeneity that you skipped? I was very curious, because it looked like a big example. Yeah. And I was very curious about effects among the poorest versus the rich.
So we don't do heterogeneity by the wealth levels, but we look at heterogeneity by age, heterogeneity by gender. We do find that it is like a targeted program, so it basically goes to the poorest, because it is for the BPL, it means the below poverty line, and it does go to the poor households. So I wouldn't expect like any effects on the richer households, because we really don't receive them. But we do find like interesting heterogeneity effects by age. So the age sample that we use in the main effects is from 0 to 19 years. So it also includes adolescents and children. But in the heterogeneity results, we find that it's mostly concentrated on children and early adolescents. We don't find any effects on 15 plus, this age group of late adolescents, 15 to 20. And especially girl children from 0 to 9, and we don't find any effects on girl children, even during adolescence, consistent with their growth trajectories.
Yeah, I understand about it all being below the poverty line, but I was worried about depth of poverty, and perhaps even also degree of stunting. So the quantile regression approach on something, and then in terms of response with respect to the depth of poverty, whether perhaps those very poorest might have some positive elasticity demand for the people themselves, and they would actually be.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. Yeah, we've not looked at the formulas or the baseline kind of status. Or crazy, so.
We do find, I mean, suggested we do find bigger income effects for the poorest quintile. So there does seem to be this spillover into the labor market. I mean, and that's definitely where we're seeing the biggest effect there. But yeah, no, it's a good point. We should do that.
Right. Yeah, the income effects seem to be purely concentrated on the poorest, the bottom people. Yeah.
So I'm not sure I understood that part clearly, but you showed the map where most of the states which are in the green are in southern India. Is it true? If it is, the question is historically north and south has a lot of differences in terms of economic development and say access to even forward education.
Right.
So do you think we should maybe test more on just looking at the sample,
Right.
maybe regional sample approach?
It's actually pretty geographically dispersed because we have Maharashtra, Gujarat, Andhra Pradesh. It's only Jharkhand, which who are already compliant.
So you said there are some states which delayed the compliance.
That's right.
So probably there is a significant.
That's right. And then what we know is the states that are offered. But we don't do that variation. That's why we use this ID strategy to assume away that variation, because we might be concerned that some of these state elections and politics might be associated with Chinese.
Well, let's open it up to other sort of questions back to this. I mean, you can ask Abby more questions, but you can also have Jimmy and say questions as well.
I just have a question. If you look at a lot of your results are, focused on just the net effect of the transfers, but
Right.
earlier in the presentation, you talked about the convergence of price.
Yes.
Have you looked, and maybe I missed the sheet.
Sure. Yeah.
Have you looked at any, before and after effects on what happened in the price change?
Yes, so we do see that the rise in wheat prices reduces, so which is consistent with previous result, and also clearly that in this food increase in supply, the supply shock, and that reduces prices. But the magnitude of the price of it is quite small. So we find that it reduces total price by around 1%, which is I mean, just the back end of calculation gives us that the income effect through the price is less than 1.1% of the cost. Very small. It is true that with that reduction in price, they can buy more, especially the consumers. But that effect is pretty small, and in terms of magnitude, cannot explain full results. But what the other mechanism that we explored in terms of looking at labor markets that we find with really big effects on wages on of poor hospitals. So increase in wages improves earnings for labor suppliers. And that we find as this multiplier effect. So basically for the poorest quintile, it doubles the transfer. It adds an additional transfer, like 35 rupees is a transfer segment, adds an additional rupees for the poorest. The poorest also because they are wage suppliers and they benefit the most out of the wage.
Other questions for any of the presenters?
Yeah, so would you be able to put this into perspective of climate effects, meaning that you have a bad climate shock and the policy seems to be largely mitigated with climate effects. But I'm wondering how large would that be? Right. So how far can we mitigate climate using compressors?
Yeah, we find that I think some back then of that position, find that 30%, 25% attenuated by, but we're not like very confident about the extent of because we need to think about like a policy experiment of like no transfer versus a complete because a lot of households already have get the PDS. But what we can be very sure of is the larger effects during the environment motion. Yeah.
Right, genuinely, just had a 90-50 question.
Sure.
What's the data source, number one?
Sure.
And second, is this like a longitudinal study or just a cross section?
Yeah, so the data source is from INCREASE VDSA, the list dynamics, South Asia, which is a panel. It's a panel of households and individuals over like 5 years. So individual panel. So we have anthropometric data on Sunday for children for 5 years, and also household consumption over 5 years.
What's your gut instinct in terms of mechanism? I mean, we showed sort of suggestive results, not suggestive results in terms of the land use change. But I mean, you also said right at the end, I mean, you're looking at these sort of short run variations in sea salinity, which I can imagine not necessarily translating directly to salinity, like soil salinity.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you think is going on?
So okay, our biggest concern here is so whether it's an income effect or whether there are other house effects that are lurking around here, and we come with our data, we can't identify like what like okay, we tested for a bunch of diseases, the impact of salinity on a bunch of diseases, none of them is significant. But then we know that salt is only affecting like adults mainly through hypertension and part of that. So like, that's one. And two, I mean, I don't think about this.
Yeah.
It's
really finding something that's pretty strong. Yeah.
And it's a hard question. I would think about this as into a climate shock story where I frame it into climate shock story, and I have to think more about this. But
yeah, I'm also like still thinking about the mechanism which right. So the story there is like an income, a change in income, right?
Yeah.
That more salinity would change land use.
So more salinity would mean that agricultural yield is. So land use would be one of the ways to adapt from salinity, but then the adaptation has a cost, meaning that if you're adapting away to different crop varieties or different cropping patterns, you're essentially causing crop. So that's at least one way we think that's contributing to the. We tested for the whole data is complete, so we can get very little about it.
Any last questions for the presenters? Otherwise, I will let people move to get coffee. Refreshment. Hey, all right, thanks everybody.